Thank you, Steve. Hmm.
Okay,
Okay.
Greta, off you go.
Yeah. Okay. Hello and good evening to all of you who've signed up and who've arrived here for a talk with Andrew Feenberg, sorry. And my name is Greta Sykes. I'm the chair or one of the chairs of the Socialist History Society, which we would all like you to join and do lots of lovely writing for us. Andrew, at the minute, I read, holds the Canada Research Chair in the Philosophy of Technology in the School of Communications at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I've looked up, Andrew, you've done loads and loads of books, lots and lots of writing, putting together science, technology, and philosophy. And I found this. I'd like to read this out. This is about the book you wrote on where is it? The technosystem, the social life of reason. And it's really interesting what it says here in this review, in Theory, Culture, and Society. Science, you're saying, science criticizes and transcends lived experience. That is to say, scientific doctrine regularly refutes our common sense understanding of nature. On the other hand, lived experience provides us with values that correspond to realities science may not understand, indeed, may never understand. I like that very much. It's sort of bringing together the lived experience and the science, which reminds me of the book called Metaphysical Animals, which I've just done a review on, where it is four women philosophers brought the real life philosophy back in the 30s. And somebody wrote a book about that, very interesting. So I'd like to welcome you, Andrew, and let's listen to what Andrew has to tell us, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Greta. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. Does it work?
Yes, it's there.
Okay. Great. So now I'm going to present a paper here, which I'm calling the New Lukács. You'll see why. And I'll read the paper. And I have some slides, most of which are just to help you with quotations. It's quite a few quotations. So, okay, let me start now. On my return in 1964 from studying Lukács in France, I borrowed the original German edition of Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein. There you can see the cover of the book. I was lucky to find one of the only copies in North America. The yellowed pages printed on high sulfite paper in 1923 cracked as I turned them. The book was still readable only because it had remained closed and forgotten on the shelf since World War II. Later, the book would attract the attention of a new generation of readers to whom I belonged, who were poorly equipped to understand it. As interest in Lukács revives, it is worth taking a critical look at the terms on which his thought was assimilated in this second reception and its relevance to our time. Lukács wrote History and Class Consciousness under difficult conditions in exile, and the essays of which it is composed are dense and disorganized. They range from a eulogy to Rosa Luxemburg to an analysis of Kantian philosophy, from reflections on the Revolutionary Party to considerations on landscape painting, from discussions of Marx's Capital to a critique of Plato's theory of forms. In terms of contemporary sources, Lukács was influenced by Luxemburg and Lenin, but also by Husserl, Weber, Simmel, Dilthey, Rickert, Lask, and many other thinkers who are rarely read today, except by specialists. The temptation to reduce this extraordinary book to a few readily understandable and consistent notions seems to be irresistible. But Lukács's argument is far from simple. By now, his famous book is known primarily through very negative and one-sided critical accounts. Let's see if I can do this. The reception of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness has always been fraught, even frankly hostile. The early attacks among Marxists in the Soviet Union provoked Lukács to write a defense of his book, but he did not publish it, and it has only recently been available. The defense clarified his views on science, the subject of Orthodox communists' most ferocious critique. As Coletti later complained, Lukács entered the factory not with Marx, but with Bergson. In 1971, soon after the English translation came out, Gareth Stedman Jones published a widely read version of a similar complaint in the New Left Review. He claimed that History and Class Consciousness, quote, represents the first major eruption of the romantic anti-scientific tradition of bourgeois thought into Marxist theory. Lukács was supposed to be under the influence of Simmel and various other German romantics he admired before he became a Marxist. What traces remain of his early views are clearly fenced off from his position on natural science. Jones had only to read to page 10 to make this discovery. There, Lukács writes, quote, it's like I missed this. Lukács writes, when the ideal of scientific knowledge is applied to nature, it simply furthers the progress of science. But when it is applied to society, it turns out to be an ideological weapon of the bourgeoisie. While it may be tempting to assimilate Lukács's critique of reification to a romantic call for immediacy, that is a travesty of his much more complex argument. Reification is a dialectical phenomenon. On the one hand, revealing society as a human creation, not the work of a creator God, while on the other hand, casting society in the form of nature, subject to strict economic laws over which human beings have no control. Under socialism, supposedly, the achievement of secular and scientific understanding must be preserved, even as the de-reification of the economy overthrows the laws of capitalism. What Lukács objected to was thus only the use of natural scientific methods to analyze the social system. In sum, he pleaded for the specificity of social science, hardly a romantic crotchet. Paradoxically, critics like Jones and Coletti revived interest in History and Class Consciousness despite consigning the book to the proverbial dustbin. In this respect, their attacks had a different effect from the early reviews of Deborin, Rudis, and other Russian communists. Lukács's book practically disappeared after 1923 to be republished in Germany with his permission in 1967. It was available earlier in 1960 in French translation, which is how I first read it. I studied the book in Lucien Goldman's class in Paris, along with Michael Levy. We wrote books about Lukács at about the same time, attempting to find a new path for Marxism in his work. But our voice was drowned out in the English-speaking world by a chorus of attacks on history and class consciousness. The doxa of the time was entirely negative. Lukács's concept of reification was romantic. His concept of totality was Hegelian rather than Marxist. His theory of class consciousness led directly to Stalinism. He either viewed nature as a mere construction or, on the contrary, cleaved history from nature, and so on. Lukács himself piled on, attacking his own early book in the preface to the new edition for confounding objectification with alienation. The one heritage of history and class consciousness that survived the attacks was the concept of reification. This concept, which appears only once or twice in Marx, became the central category of Lukács's Marxism. It appeared, usually without citation, in the works of the Frankfurt School. It is important for Adorno, where it takes the form of instrumental reason. And more recently, Axel Honneth has written a book specifically on reification in an attempt to update the concept. In the 1960s, reification inspired the dystopian arguments of the Frankfurt School that culminated in Marcuse's concept of one-dimensionality. Paradoxically, these arguments resonated with young people whose protests had a huge impact in the 1960s. When the students at Berkeley paraded in 1964 with giant posters in the form of computer punch cards, they unwittingly, and in some cases wittingly, reprised Lukács's critique of capitalist reification. Inspired in part by these protests, my book on Lukács came out in 1981. Seems like a long time ago. It had no influence on the major players in critical theory who were fascinated by Habermas, while in England, Althusser held sway among Marxists. In contrast with the usual view of reification as an ideology, I propose to treat it as a cultural phenomenon, patterning not only thought, but also behavior and the very materiality of the society. This was my interpretation of Lukács's concept of the form of objectivity, an essential category of the book mistranslated in English, in the English version, as I will explain later in this paper. This alternative interpretation came naturally to me as a student of Marcuse, with his rather similar concept of one-dimensionality. Marcuse argued that one-dimensionality went beyond ideology to create what he called a world. As Stanley Aronowitz writes, quote, "The explosive thesis of one-dimensional man was to have freed ideology critique from the mental realm and to have endowed it with onto-historical status," end quote. A careful reading of Lukács's text shows something similar. If Lukács himself did not use the category of culture in his account of reification, this was no doubt due to its conservative connotations at the time. But today, culture is merely a category of social science, and as such, is useful for understanding Lukács's concept of reification. The significance of substituting culture for ideology in the interpretation of the concept of reification only became clear to students of Lukács much later. The cultural approach made it possible to reinterpret Marx's critique of capitalism as a whole in terms of the concept of reification. This marked a significant departure from earlier economistic versions of Marxism and brought Marxism up to date with the social sciences of Lukács's time and ours. These social sciences appeared as reflexes of the industrialization process, which reached a climax toward the end of the 19th century. By the early 1920s, it was clear that the effects of industrialism went well beyond the expansion of the market into ever more aspects of social life. Apparent to Lukács, as to many of his contemporaries, was the parallel growth of mechanization and bureaucracy. Lukács extended the Marxian critique of market rationality to cover the whole of modern capitalist society, technology, administration, the media, and so on. Together with markets, these new techniques of production and organization amounted to the total submission of society to quantification and lawfulness, what Max Weber called rationalization. The natural sciences are the paradigm case of rationality in this society. Analytic forms of rationality, resembling those successfully imposed on nature through experimentation, research, and technology have become social forms. Analysis depends on fragmentation and quantification. All the institutions of the society are set off against each other as independent things with their own laws of motion. The autonomized fragments are then pressed into external and accidental relationships on the market. Reified social reality is treated as a second nature, with laws that appear as rigid as those of the first nature described by natural science, although in reality they are contingent on social arrangements can be changed. The reified subjects of capitalism understand social reality on the model of science and act on it technically. The technical manipulations are based on knowledge of nature of the laws and cannot change them. As Francis Bacon said, quote, nature to be commanded must be obeyed, end quote. So Lukács writes, quote, man in capitalist society confronts a reality made by himself as a class, which appears to him to be a natural phenomenon, alien to himself. He is wholly at the mercy of its laws. His activity is confined to the exploitation of the inexorable fulfillment of certain individual laws for his own egoistic interests. But even while acting, he remains in the nature of the case, the object and not the subject of events. End quote. Reification is exemplified by the situation of the industrial worker. The worker's machines present themselves in their completion and their independence. They determine the type and quality of the work, not vice versa. The worker submits to the discipline imposed by the machine, and the more advanced is the mechanization, the more this discipline consists in simply contemplating and controlling from the outside the nearly self-sufficient productive activity of the machine. Work becomes a contemplative attitude in relation to a mechanical process governed by laws like those of nature, wholly independent of consciousness. Not even the vaunted work of entrepreneurs escapes this reified form. Although they appear to be active and original, in fact, their activity amounts to nothing more than another form of calculation and contemplation, the object being profit rather than production. Investors act not by creating something new, but by anticipating what will happen regardless of what they do. And it is precisely these anticipations that reproduce the market from one iteration to the next. According to Lukács, this is the very model of practice under capitalism, essential to the functioning and reproduction of the system. Reification, he writes, I thought I had this, maybe this. Here's the quote. Reification, he writes, is an abstraction of human labor objectified in commodities. Its historical possibility determined by the real performance of this process of abstraction, end quote. In constantly buying and selling commodities, including intellectual products, or working in mechanized industries and engaging with bureaucracies, the members of capitalist society live and reproduce the reified relationships that construct the society. Thus, reification is in the first instance an aspect of practice rather than a theoretical concept or mental attitude. It arises from the way individuals act when they accept the reification of their social reality. Practices establish a world within which reified objects appear. These objects are understood immediately. It's a Hegelian concept of immediacy. That is to say, without critical awareness, in a reified standpoint as substantial things. That standpoint is derivative of the practices, not their origin. But the standpoint contributes to the reproduction of the world the practices sustain. The crises of capitalism and its inhumanity show the limits of reified rationality as applied to the social world. The limits of scientific reason are revealed as the limits of capitalism. Thus, history and class consciousness appeared as a critique of analytic reason, transcending in good Hegelian fashion a new, more powerful dialectical form of rationality. Lukács let's see, when were we here? I don't think we're quite there yet. Lukács argues that only the proletariat can break the circle of reified practice. A broader view of reality is open to the victims of the economic system. Lukács, and this which makes resistance possible. Lukács writes, quote, the quantitative differences in exploitation which appear to the capitalist in the form of quantitative determinants of the objects of his calculation must appear to the workers as the decisive qualitative categories of his whole physical, mental, and moral existence. This explains why the working class can, in principle, de-reify the structures capitalism imposes, whereas the bourgeoisie cannot. In Lukács's Hegelian terminology, the worker relates the economic laws to the totality, which includes their human and natural context, whereas the capitalist is caught in immediacy, unable to transcend the reified appearances. Totality is another Lukácsian category that is routinely abused by the critics. Could the totality be an impossible inventory of all that is? Only someone who has not read the book could imagine that this is Lukács's meaning. Is there perhaps a connection between totality and totalitarianism, a refusal of difference? But Lukács writes, quote, we repeat, the category of totality does not reduce its various elements to an undifferentiated uniformity, to identity, end quote. Or is Lukács channeling a supposedly expressive totality? This is an Althusserian concept, posited by some sort of transcendental subject. As for that, Lukács writes, quote, it is true that the proletariat is the conscious subject of total social reality, but the conscious subject is not defined here as in Kant, where subject is defined as that which can never be an object, end quote. Rather, according to Lukács, the subject is engaged in interaction with all the elements of the social system. Lukács explains further. So here's the quote, the interaction we have in mind must be more than the interaction of otherwise unchanging objects. It must go further in its relation to the whole, for this relation determines the form of objectivity of every object of cognition. Every substantial change that is of concern to knowledge manifests itself as a change in relation to the whole, and through this as a change in the form of objectivity itself, end quote. By totality, Lukács thus actually means the system of functional and conflictual relations among the various institutions and actors at play under capitalism. Unlike the facts of natural science, which must be isolated from each other to be explained, social phenomena are essentially interrelated and achieve what Lukács calls their intelligibility through their relations. Where the meanings of natural facts are mere conceptual categories and the interactions of the facts purely causal, the meanings of social phenomena motivate the human actions that in turn construct them as such. As those meanings shift and interrelate through the action that sustains them, the social system changes. Lukács concludes that totality is not only a theoretical representation of society, such as Marx's Capital, but is also a real force that alters the relations between the entities that make up the society. Proletarian resistance is said to aim at the totality, as it appears in action. That resistance explains the possibility of Marxist theory, the translation of the lived de-reification of the totality by the working class into the objective form of a critique of political economy. In 2014, I returned to my book on Lukács and revised it quite drastically. Here you can see the first and the second version. I revised it quite drastically on the basis of Lukács's defense of history and class consciousness, which wasn't available when I first wrote the book, and a better understanding of German neo-Kantianism and phenomenology. I was now able to go more deeply into Lukács's critique of science and rationality. This new version appeared at a time when a number of younger scholars were beginning to question the standard interpretations of Lukács. So here are some interesting new books. Books by Konstantinos Kavourakos, Richard Westerman, and Daniel Lopez followed up on my cultural approach while bringing new perspectives to bear on Lukács's difficult text. I recommend these books as an anecdote to much of the earlier scholarship, which all too often was ignorant of the details of Lukács's intellectual context. Unfortunately, the English translation of History and Class Consciousness has made it more difficult than it should be to understand Lukács's position. For example, consider this version of one of the key sentences in the whole book. After asserting that the commodity is the central structural issue in understanding every aspect of capitalist society, Lukács adds, quote, "Only in this case can the structure of commodity relations be made to yield a model of all the objective forms of bourgeois society, together with all the subjective forms corresponding to them," end quote. The sentence seems to make sense, but what is an objective form? Unless we understand this concept, it is not clear what Lukács is trying to say. In fact, the German original does make it clear. In place of the translator's objective forms, we find the neo-Kantian term Gegenständigkeitsformen, which should be translated in English as form of objectivity. This term refers to a particular way of being an object, a particular type of what we might call thing. In the contemporary German context, such ways are multiple. In treating the deified form of objectivity as culture, I made a bridge between the Marxist theory of capitalism and the concerns of German philosophy and sociology. The latter struggled to save a remnant of Geist from the aggressive advance of business and technology. These neo-Kantians introduced the concept of the form of objectivity to distinguish meaning from factual existence. They hoped in this way to differentiate the objects of science, art, and history. Each type of object was said to reflect its specific domain of meaning, that is, its form of objectivity. In this way, they attempted to escape the grip of a scientism that reflected the totalization of capitalist industrialism. Here's an example. Picasso's Guernica is a mixture of chemicals for natural science, a political statement in the public sphere, and a painting for viewers in the Prado. Each of these is a coherent cross-section of the infinite complexity of experience. In the sentence I have highlighted, Lukács is saying that the commodity exemplifies a particular way of being an object that characterizes all objects in bourgeois society and shapes the subjective response to those objects. Of course, objects of all sorts exist in capitalist society, as the example of Guernica shows, but they are all marked by the possibility of their transformation into a commodity. Guernica is said to be worth $200 million. I don't think it's for sale, but that's its possible auction price. Reification has become the ultimate meaning of objectivity under capitalism, its cultural form. But the gap between meaning and existence shows up in a problem that already worried Kant: the unknowable thing in itself. If we know objects exclusively through their meanings, through the meanings we attribute to them, that's their form of objectivity, their concrete reality tends to escape our knowledge. Kant hypothesized a reality behind experience, occasioning it somehow. This hypothesis was conveniently excluded by the Neo-Kantians, but it came back to haunt them as the sheer existence, the content of the meanings implicated in the form of objectivity. The example of Guernica illustrates the problem. What is the underlying reality of the thing that appears as a chemical mixture, a public statement, and a painting? What is the unity, the ultimate content behind these diverse forms of objectivity? Lukács appropriated these neo-Kantian concepts and reduced them to their sociological correlates under capitalism in a procedure I call metacritique. As we have seen, he argued that the reified commodity form corresponds to meaning in the neo-Kantian construction, while the contents would then correspond to use and the concrete act of labor. That's the sociological reduction of the philosophical concept of form of objectivity. A similar relation between form and content prevails in relation to bureaucracy and law. Rigid concepts meet particular circumstances. In each case, the social form is structured in terms of analytic categories, while the contents of the forms belong to a different register. What then is the general relation between reification as a form of objectivity and those contents? Can the reified meanings fully determine the content, or is there a remainder that escapes from any formal structuring? The Kantian problematic of the tension between form and content, meaning and the thing in itself, reappears now in the relation of analytic rationality to the human beings whose lives it shapes. Where Neo-Kantianism had found a theoretical limit, Lukács identified a practical one: resistance to the imposition of capitalist forms, class struggle. You may ask what these philosophical reflections add to the usual account of class struggle based on the exploitation of the proletariat. In fact, Lukács's argument brought Marxism into the 20th century. Previously, Marxists had denounced the irrationality of capitalism, but it was no longer possible to believe this without a significant concession. On the contrary, capitalism had been rationalized to the point where rationality itself appeared as part of the problem. Of course, at the macro level, capitalism still produced crises and so could said to be irrational, but the organization of all social institutions around rational methods imitated from scientific reason required a new approach. This would have consequences for the idea of socialism Marxists failed to heed. Engels, for example, believed the separation of management from ownership and the creation of national trusts anticipated the planned society. Lenin adopted a similar approach to planning the Soviet economy. Such notions proved naive in the light of the consequences of rationalization under socialism. Far from liberating labor, the Soviet systems perpetuated its enslavement to capital now in the form of national capital. Meanwhile, a more democratic notion of socialism based on workers' councils was suppressed, yet it might have had more legitimacy and staying power than the bureaucratic Soviet system. Lukács did not anticipate all this in 1923. His ideas on revolution were primarily influenced by the early success in Russia. He advocated both workers' councils and a strong state without realizing their incompatibility in the form they took in Russia. He could not imagine the catastrophic effects of the Soviet version of rationalization, which was even more indifferent to its contents, namely the lives it structured, than the capitalist version. Nevertheless, there are indications in his writings in this period that suggest the relevance of his theory of reification to issues that concern us today. Lukács's concept of revolution retains the usual notion of a dramatic reversal, the sudden overthrow of the established property relations and political system. But he is aware that the transition to socialism will be long and complicated, and thus acknowledges the limitations of the revolution. Methodological suggestions appear in his tentative reflections on the transition that are relevant today, despite the collapse of his concept of proletarian revolution. Lukács understood that there can be no escape from some sort of rationalization in a modern society. Reification will persist even under socialism. Industrial technology, bureaucracy, law will continue to dominate human beings through rational procedures in some form, whatever the political system. He writes, quote, "There can be no single act that eliminates reification in all its forms at one blow. It means that there will be a whole host of objects that, at least in appearance, remain more or less affected by the process."
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Sorry, my internet collapsed. I'm doing it on my phone now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve.
So are we ready?
Yeah, sorry about that. If you carry on, God knows what happened to the internet, but someone will hear about it.
Thank you for being quick, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. The persistence of reification shows up in the fragmentation of the technical disciplines that organize the society. Lukács argues that specialization is essential to the production of knowledge in modern societies. The splitting up of the disciplines and their achievement of relative independence is a condition sine qua non of cognitive advance. Each discipline combines an aspect of social life, processed in terms of natural scientific knowledge, while also reflecting capitalist system imperatives of one sort or another. For example, medicine is an independent discipline based in large part on physics and chemistry, and yet many aspects of the medical system are bound up with capitalism. For example, the bias toward pharmaceutical cure over environmental and lifestyle change. There seems to be an inconsistency here. How can Lukács endorse the fragmentation of knowledge while criticizing the fragmentation of society? Specialization is not simply thrown out in his conception, but is related to the wider totality. Lukács writes, quote, "What is decisive is whether this process of isolation of the sciences is a means toward understanding the whole, and whether it is integrated within the context it presupposes and requires, or whether the abstract knowledge of an isolated fragment retains its autonomy and becomes an end in itself." End quote. Each discipline must be related to the totality and to its underlying material and human base. In each case, the autonomy of the discipline and the imposition of its strictures on the underlying population requires critical mediation. Contextualization must overcome the limits of specialization. This is a good description of the way in which Marx's Capital attempts to transform political economy, relating the laws of the market to the material conditions of production. A similar approach could apply in principle to every technical discipline that structures social life. But Lukács remains at this very high level of abstraction in his discussion of specialization, only mentioning briefly disciplines other than economics. Yet already in his time, and certainly in ours, many other scientific and technical disciplines play a role in social life. Lukács claims that, quote, what is known as economics is nothing but the system of forms of objectivity defining this real life, end quote. What he says here of economics is true of a multitude of disciplines. Engineering is an obvious example. The design of machines and the technical environment structures life no less than economics. The same could be said for architecture, medicine, criminology, agronomy, and food science, the sciences of education, management science, and so on. The application of the theory of reification to all these disciplines would yield a rather different result from the largely economic argument of traditional Marxism. In many cases, the material aspects of the objects of the disciplines play a much larger role than in economics. The beauty of economic science is the possibility of abstracting the economic relations from their material base. The science is indifferent to the qualitative features of the commodities it studies, much less the technologies involved in creating those commodities. Although Marx incorporated that material base, into his theory, until recently most Marxists imagined an economic revolution that would substitute planning for markets while expanding the technological underpinnings inherited from capitalism. That is not a plausible solution once the reification of all the technical disciplines is taken into account. It is not only the market that is loaded with the irrational effects of capitalism, but as Marx showed, the material base as well. Today we understand that technical disciplines such as engineering and medicine also bear the mark of the capitalist system in which they function. We must take that into account, prolonging Marx's original critique of industry and agriculture well beyond the limits of his time. At stake are the very designs of the technologies and systems which can be more or less humane, more or less sustainable. Social movements focus the attention of society on realities that were previously overlooked or underestimated. These movements do not have the totalizing potential Lukács attributed to the proletariat, but they are essentially dereifying in a specific sphere and function as collective subjects in something like Lukács' sense. The environmental movement, for example, has potentiated major changes in industrial technologies. Such movements aim toward what Lukács called the totality. They join up aspects of social reality that have been artificially isolated, reified, by the specializations of the technical disciplines and the technocratic corporations and agencies based on them. These underdetermined aspects of the disciplines are the result of human choice, and so can be challenged through political action. The politics must be translated back into the horizon and procedures of the disciplines. The political movements then retreat or dissolve as their effects are consolidated. Perhaps this is part of what Lukács had in mind when he wrote, quote, this revolutionary process is no single, repeated, unrepeatable tearing of the veil that masks the process, but the unbroken alternation of ossification, contraction, and movement, end quote. Reification and dereification alternate, just as Lukács envisaged, but in this case, not in the socialist transition, but rather in the technical politics of capitalist society. Although Lukács points out that reification would not go away completely, even after a socialist revolution, he holds out hope for a less conflictual form of modern life. The ultimate promise of socialism is not a utopia of pure, unmediated activism, as his critics contend, but a fluid relation between social forms and human content. He writes, this assumes that the world which confronts man in theory and practice exhibits a kind of objectivity which, if properly thought out and understood, need never stick fast in an immediacy similar to that of forms found earlier on. This objectivity must accordingly be comprehensible as a constant factor mediating between past and future, and it must be possible to demonstrate that it is everywhere the product of man and of the development of society, end quote. Here, Lukács seems to imagine an alternative form of objectivity compatible with socialist democracy. Once we understand Lukács in these terms, where can we go, both theoretically and practically? We must heed the contents of the reified forms. Those contents manifest themselves in progressive social movements that resist the rationality of the established system in the name of an alternative form of rationality that privileges human concerns over capital. In my work, I have focused on the technical politics that has arisen out of the ashes of the New Left. Movements in medicine, urban affairs, communication, and the environment aim directly at mediating between technical rationalization and human and natural needs. Other movements, for example, around race and gender, need to be studied in terms of the logic of reification and de-reification. This is the living legacy of Lukács's famous book. So I'm going to conclude now by showing you the cover of my my most recent book. It's a book about Marcuse, but it's largely inspired by Lukács's theory of reification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the end. Now we can see if there are questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. That was a great exploration of the very complex ideas that Georgi Lukács has been expressing, and that seem to have gone through a phase of up and down interest and various interpretations, both in the Soviet Union as well as in the West. And so let's open things up to questions and discussion points. We might just well have them both, and we could take one or two, maybe three, depending on how many people would like to say something. You can say something by putting your hand, yeah, like David, for instance, shows how to do it, and Steve as well. You can put a little hand up and I make a note of it. You can also write comments in the chat. You can see already there are a couple of chats there. So if you don't get in quickly, if you want to say something, then you can always do a little chat and we pick it up afterwards. So I see at the minute we have two hands. Was David, were you first? Three hands now. David?
Yeah, I'll go first. I don't mind.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's a very inspiring talk. Very a lot to take in a presentation over the internet. I've been reading Lukács since I was a student because I picked up a book called Marxists on Literature, edited by David Craig, and there I found a few excerpts from Lukács' studies of Walter Scott and other writers like Kafka. He was very critical of modernist writers, and I was inspired to look at other aspects of Lukács, and then I picked up books like History and Class Consciousness. I actually met a friend of mine was Stanley Mitchell, who translated Lukács' book, The Historical Novel. I met him in the early 80s, and he unfortunately passed away, I think, in about 2010 or something. But he was, I think he translated quite a few of Lukács' works, but the main one was The Historical Novel. You mentioned that the translation of History and Class Consciousness is a hindrance to a true understanding of his work. So maybe you can say something about is there any plans to do a new translation of, because it's like 50 years ago since it was translated. Often works are translated more than once. And is there a complete work of Lukács available, even in German or in his home country? a couple of years ago, there was the threat to the Lukács archive from the government of Hungary. I've not heard anything about that since. I don't know if you know anything about this, what state that's at now. And I'd be interested to finding more out about that if you have any insights, but mainly if there's any plans, possibilities to translate, retranslate his work again, because it as you say, it needs to be more transparent. His political ideas, as we know that he's still a controversial figure, and maybe you can speculate why he's still a controversial figure. I mean, I think people like that little book, Modern Masters. It's a very sort of a kind of Cold War view of Lukács, and a lot of the commentators on Lukács seem to be berating him for not being a Trotskyite, for not being sufficiently anti-communist. But if we understand Lukács, I think his commitment to the work from a wealthy background, he threw in his lot with the workers' movement, and that was his lifelong commitment. And I think that's something which is something symbolic and important for today in the crisis which we face today, to actually support the political change that's necessary to bring about a better society. And anyway, that's a bit of a speech at the end, but the main question was about the translations. And thank you very much anyway for your talk.
Thank you, David. Would you like to respond to this? You could respond briefly. Yes, there is a translation, or there will be, or not, or to the whole speech.
New translation.
Yeah.
I've not heard of anyone intending to translate the book again. The existing translation is not terrible. It's pretty good. You can learn a lot without knowing German. But there are some terminological problems because the translator evidently was not conversant with German neo-Kantianism, and so it doesn't. So there are some things that could definitely be improved, but I have not heard of anybody planning to do this.
Maybe they should.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Should we move on at this point? Steve, and then David Margolis. Steve.
Yeah. You spoke of the description of the painting of Guernica, and but I can't see how you can have a proper discussion of Guernica without discussing the matter of the aerial bombardment of civilian populations, which it seemed to me was what it was about. And since then, we've gone through Dresden, through what happened in Iraq, to what's happening in Gaza today, and the kind of that horror of aerial bombardment, which Guernica was a remarkable protest against. And I think, sort of, is there not a danger of forgetting that and kind of why Picasso claimed he painted it in the first place?
Well, of course.
Thank you, Steve. Would you like to respond, Andrew?
Sure. As I said, there are three ways to talk about the painting, and one of the ways is indeed what you recommend, namely thinking of the painting in terms of its public importance as a protest against the bombing of that small town in Spain. And of course, that can be a symbol for all the bombings of all the towns that get blown up by wars today. So, but that doesn't mean that the painting has only that meaning. It has that meaning plus other meanings. And that was the puzzle that arose around the concept of a form of objectivity. The painting is not only a public protest against the bombing, but also a painting, that's say a work of art in a museum, which could be viewed simply in terms of its artistic aspects as an aesthetic object. And it's also a physical object made with certain chemicals. I mean, when we study old paintings, we're interested in what are the chemicals that they brought to bear on the production of the work. So these are just different aspects, and each one corresponds to a specific type of thinghood that the object contains.
Thank you, Andrew.
And then, of course, yeah,
Actually,
I should mention the last form of objectivity is money.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, could I just on this point, because Steve is making a point that I would think as well, because the painting by Picasso is pointedly very dramatic and fearful, full of anger, fury, full of human emotion. And for me, listening to you, there's a lot of theoretical language in the Lukács work, and it makes you feel a distance to it. It doesn't take you near enough to say, for instance, what Steve said, the events that are taking place right now that are fearful and dramatic and shocking, and all the other events like that continue taking place while people talk. I just add that as another thought. But we have David Margulis next, and then we have Chris Norris, and then we pay attention to some of the chats that are here on the side. David.
Thank you, Greta. I would like to ask you about one specific thing. A Hungarian academician, Joseph Szély, wrote a book on Lukács's use of Christopher Caudwell and said that Lukács was very heavily indebted to Caudwell. That's I can show the book here. That's I can't read Hungarian. He told me in detail about it. And I wondered whether you had any sense of Lukács's response or relation to Caudwell.
Well, I doubt that Caudwell had any influence on history and class consciousness, and that's, from the early 1920s. I don't think there was any contact. I'm not even sure Caudwell was writing. I'm not sure what his dates are, but now later on, when Lukács went to Russia and became essentially a literary critic, and stopped. He did write still things about Hegel, but he was much less interested in philosophy and much more in the literary criticism that we heard about earlier. At that point, it's quite possible that he was interested in the work of Caudwell. I don't really know, though, because that's not my area. I'm not that cognizant of what he was doing at that time. Was Caudwell a critic of modernism? As Lukács was.
Well, yes, he was, but not so narrow as that.
There's a funny story about Lukács. Maybe I should have said this. Lukács was one of the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution in 1919, and that revolution lasted for a month or two until it was overthrown by a fascist dictatorship. And then in 1956, when Imre Nagy came into power as the head of a sort of a reformed version of Soviet communism in Hungary, Lukács was again called by the government this is the first time since 1919 that anyone had shown any interest in his political abilities. He joined that government and of course, that government was overthrown quickly, and Lukács, the Soviet Union sent in troops, and Nagy and the other people were all sent, imprisoned, and some of them were executed. Lukács is said to have spent several months in I guess in a chateau somewhere in Romania, I think. And he's supposed to have told his wife, maybe Kafka was right after all. So he had a second thought about his attacks on modernism.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Chris. We'll have Chris Norris. Chris Norris, your turn to put your question or you make your point, Chris.
Yeah, you mentioned, or perhaps Greta mentioned in her introductory remarks, that you'd studied with Lucien Goldman. And I can remember reading Goldman on all sorts of things, really, a very long time ago, on Kant and on Pascal and on the Noblesse de la Robe, and reading Lukács about the same time, sort of reading around fairly randomly at that time, and thinking that they make a very odd pair in a sense. You can't imagine Goldman being very much on a wavelength, theoretically, perhaps politically, but certainly theoretically, with Lukács, partly because genetic structuralism, although it does have room for a certain concept of subjectivity, doesn't have anything like Lukács's emphasis on subjectivity as an active, sort of historically dynamic force. So I wondered what exactly in his teaching, but did he actually teach Lukács's work, or did he touch on Lukács in the course of some larger program?
No, the whole year was Lukács. We started with the theory of the novel, which had just been translated into French, and then we went on to history and class consciousness. We didn't do anything with the later literary criticism. Well, Goldman was impressed by the concept of reification and used it in his own development of Marxist theory. That's a good question, actually, but he was really the chief person who tried to resuscitate Lukács from the ashes after so many years of indifference and the essential disappearance of history and class consciousness. I guess I don't offhand know exactly how to answer the question. I think it has something to do with Lukács's concepts of class consciousness and the way in which Goldman was able to take that notion and develop it as a theory of social forms as they relate to literature. In other words, to attach literary forms to specific social classes. And he found in Lukács some help for doing that. His problem was, he wanted to avoid a simple, vulgar Marxist reductionism. He needed a more sophisticated notion of the relation of class to literature, and Lukács helped him do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Looking here at our chats here, somebody responded to the Codwell, Paul Leduc Brown. Codwell clearly was an influence on Lukács' later aesthetics, the Eigenart des Ästhetischen, but Codwell had no influence, of course, on history and class consciousness. Yeah. That's Paul who said that. Yeah. And somebody had to leave, and then I can't scroll these chats up. Can somebody scroll the chats up? Is Steve there? There were a couple of more chats here, which I don't.
If you want me to go back up them,
yeah.
Raid Akbar, whose name I have undoubtedly massacred. Sorry about that. A really good talk. Couple of questions. One, what was the relationship between this book and the Das Wort debate from 1938 with Lukács and the Frankfurt School? And two, what influence, if any, did he have on the Marxist theory of Raymond Williams and and Guy
Yeah.
Debord, respectively.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That
The
would be
first
very
part
useful.
I couldn't understand. What did you say? The first part?
Yeah, the
What was
first.
the relationship between this book and the Das Wort debate from 1938 with Lukács and the Frankfurt School?
I didn't know there was a debate in 1938 between Lukács and the Frankfurt School.
Right.
Das Wort.
I suppose that's an answer.
Okay, so we can't go further there, but
Well,
we
wait,
can.
there was a second question. Which I
Yeah,
could
the second
answer.
question is, could you read it out again?
What influence, if any, did he have on the Marxist theory of Raymond Williams and Guy Debord, respectively?
Mm.
Debord was very much influenced by Lukács. And that's evident in his notion of the society of the spectacle. It's essentially a theory of reification updated to the world of television. As for Raymond Williams, I'm not sure. I would guess, but I'm not an expert on Williams. I would guess that he too read Lukács and was impressed by the fact that Lukács developed a much more sophisticated version of Marxism than the commonplace versions that were current at the time.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I can't really help.
There is a question from one Andreas Peperidis. How does the notion of reification in Lukács relate or differ from the concept of reification in ideology critique? Is this part of the distinction you tried to draw when you approached it as a cultural concept in your book?
Yes, I think that's correct. Lukács does not consider reification to be an ideology. It's much more. In fact, the whole concept of ideology is complicated by the way in which he treats intellectual forms, social and intellectual forms of thought. Because for Lukács, these things have social reality. They're not simply in the head. And they're not simply like causally significant. They are actually shaping the world of the social world. The social world is in effect a product of meanings that we bring to it. And so the concept of form of objectivity this is why I think it's more like culture, because culture is also not just in the head, it's also in the institutions and the artifacts and in every aspect of social life. So in that sense, the concept of reification fits better, I think, with the notion of culture than with the notion of ideology. Now, its use as an ideological term is, of course, perfectly legitimate. I mean, nobody has a lock on the meaning of the term, but it's, I think, a bit different from what Lukács actually intended.
Okay, thank you.
And there was one question from John Holford. Would Andrew like to comment on Lukács' view of reification in relation to contemporary trends in measurement of social phenomena and the role of digitalization?
Big question. What I've tried to do is bring out from Lukács the notion of reification in order to talk about the social, the disciplines, the technical disciplines that actually structure social life. So the market is, of course, a major factor in our social existence, but so are all the other technical disciplines that construct the social world around us. And these disciplines can be understood in their social dimension through the concept of reification. So the one thing they have in common is that they are separated, isolated, specialized, and therefore leave out a great deal of the social world in which they function. And that's essential, as Lukács argues, for them to do their job, but they also need to be transcended in order to bring in the context which they eliminate in constructing themselves as a specialized discipline. And social movements have played a big role in the last 50 years or so in bringing that about. Movements in medicine, in the environment, and now also we're seeing similar movements in the realm of the internet, and these will certainly pass over into movements around AI. And the reason for this is quite simple, that none of these movements are absolute. They all are inflected by social forces of one sort or another. So it's obvious in the case of AI. What do we want AI to do? Do we want it to eliminate this profession, that profession? Do we want it to tell us who should be imprisoned? I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities. And these possibilities extend also to the structure of AI, to the sources from which it is drawn, and so on. All of this is social and will be contested politically, because we now live in a society where the technical disciplines that structure our lives are frequently treated as political problems.
Thank you, Andrew.
That's all that's in the chat, Greta.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just wanted to make a short comment here on you had on your slides the support Lucas supported the specialization of areas, and you said how that is maybe different from what you said on other matters, specialization of areas of knowledge, and whether that would lead to further isolation or to an understanding of the whole. I thought that was very interesting, because I think where we are now in society, we have all been reified, we're all things, we've all been isolated. We're being more isolated in each of our homes. The shops are closing down. You're supposed to do everything on the internet. You don't have communication. You can't get hold of agencies like telecom, the gas people, the electricity people. You can't get hold of them. They've eliminated telephone numbers. You have to go through the internet. You have become a thing of it's not a social movement, but it is the structure of capitalism that has become so monopolistic in terms of their corporations that we are all, maybe we've all become things in their system. And that obviously is a shocking thing to see, a shocking thing to experience by us individually, and of course an awful lot worse by those people who are suffering, who are at the raw end of where the capitalism is clashing with the will of the people in Gaza and so on, in the whole area in the Middle East. So that would be my comment on the matter. There are 3 more messages I see, Steve. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Andrew. Or you can
I ask Andrew to comment on this at the same time? I missed a question at the top. How might the notion of reification be augmented by the understanding of apparatus in Foucault or habitus of Bordeaux?
Oh dear.
The habitus concept in Bourdieu has to do with the way in which people incorporate in their practices and their thoughts social forms. And this is not something that Lukács discussed because he really didn't talk about psychology. It's so, I mean, I guess you could work it out somehow that the structural aspects of reification affect the way in which people see the world. Lukács has a theory of class consciousness in which you could perhaps insert something like the notion of habitus, although it's a bit of a stretch since he doesn't really ever talk about psychology. As for the apparatus, the dispositif of Foucault, I think Foucault's interest was trying to get us to see that social systems involve not both apparatuses in the normal sense, things, machines, for example, and also practices, ways of behaving, and they belong together. You can't really separate them. And this, I think, would again, Lukács would perhaps have found this interesting. It's not exactly his way of talking about society, but it's not that different, really. When you think about his notions are, they're not as fine-grained as the notions that Bourdieu and Foucault use to talk about society. So it's a little rough, I think, trying to squeeze them in.
Thank you, Andrew. Do we have any further wishes to speak here? I can't see any. Steve, can you see any, or David? So if there are no, sorry.
There's another question in the chat. Shall I read it out?
Yes, please.
Yes.
I can't see it.
How did the ideas in history and class consciousness influence Lukács' later criticism of Joyce and Kafka, if at all?
Yeah.
Is there a connection between history and class consciousness and his later writings on modernism, I think he wants to say. Anyway.
Yes.
That was...
I don't think there's not a strong connection. Lukács changed his views around 1928. You can see already a serious movement toward a more orthodox communist ideology. And he didn't want to think about history and class consciousness anymore. He just ignored it and seems to have lost track of what it really said in later times. So I'm not sure that, I think there must be some connection through the notion of type, which appears as an essential concept in his theory of literature, his later theory of literature. But I can't really work out that relationship for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the way it looks to me, unless Steve has another idea, that maybe we're coming to the end of this very splendid evening with extremely interesting talk by Andrew Feenberg. Thank you so much, Andrew. Somebody in the society will look at maybe if that can be published somewhere by the society. I would like to remind everybody here, or if you haven't heard us say this before, there is a facility to join the society, which is a lively band of people who are trying to change the world towards a better one. And with these words, unless Steve or David want to add something.
Yeah, I've got an announcement.
Oh yeah, very good. Let's have an announcement.
We've got a talk coming up on the 4th of December. It's called well, we haven't got the title yet. It's based on a book called Decadent Women.
Oh
And
yeah.
on that concept of decadence, I will quote Lukács, who said that he condemned decadence as representing inhumanity and anti-humanism in decadent art. So, so I thought there's some connection there. But this
Thank you.
is a talk.
Thank you, David.
This is a talk by Jad Adams, whose previous books include biographies of Gandhi, and his first book was a biography of Tony Benn, the British political figure. The book is concerned with women writers and artists who were around the late 19th century, especially the publication called the Yellow Book, and the concept of the new woman. So it should be quite interesting because there's lots of feminists and socialists involved in that movement, which we don't know so much about. So that's on the 4th of December at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, David. So make a note in your calendar, 4th of December. Very good to see you all. And thank you ever so much, Andrew Feenberg, and all the best for you where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oops. Oh yeah, he's put that up.
Okay.